He had the kind of arrogance that only came with inexperience. The swagger of someone who had never had to make a call that cost a life, never seen the look in someone's eyes when a mission went sideways. He was a cadet, top of his class, sharp jawline, sharper tongue. The kind who recited protocols like scripture but didn't know what real leadership felt like under fire. When she entered the room, he barely looked up. When he finally did, his eyes flicked across her civilian clothes, the absence of rank insignia, the calm expression on her face. And then he smirked, not with cruelty, but with that soft, careless superiority that so many before him had worn like cologne. The room wasn't small, but it felt tighter the moment she walked in. Her posture was steady, not stiff like someone trying too hard, not slouched like someone trying to disappear. She carried herself like a shadow with weight, unassuming yet undeniable. The general was late. A few colonels milled about near the front, eyes on tablets and files, and a couple of junior officers whispered near the back. And then the cadet, he leaned over to the lieutenant beside him and asked, too loudly to be a whisper, "Is she someone's assistant? Logistics, maybe?" The words hung in the air longer than they should have. No one responded, but a few heads turned. She didn't. Her face didn't change. No narrowed eyes, no forced smile, no raised brow. She kept studying the screen at the front of the room, waiting. The cadet looked around, shrugged to himself, and turned back toward the lieutenant with a cocky grin. To him, it was a joke. A harmless observation. A nothing comment made in the vacuum of youth. He didn't know he'd just pressed his mouth against a live wire. She wasn't looking for credit. She never did. The kind of life she'd lived didn't come with applause, and the missions she led never made headlines. They were whispered about, not recorded. The people she'd saved would never know her name. And the ones who didn't make it, well, she carried them in the quietest corners of her. That's what you do when you survive long enough to matter. She could have said something. She could have flashed credentials, thrown rank, dropped names. She could have turned to the cadet and reduced him to a stammer with one classified operation number. But she didn't. She stood still, silent, like stone beneath the surface of a calm lake. And that silence, that absolute, unflinching composure, was louder than anything she could have said. Others noticed. One of the colonels at the front glanced up, took a second look at her, then back at the cadet. His eyes narrowed, then quickly softened as he refocused on his tablet. The lieutenant next to the cadet shifted in his seat and stared straight ahead. He had recognized her. Not her face, necessarily, but the presence. The weight in the air. Like something just below the surface of normal, pressing in, daring you to say something foolish. The general arrived a few minutes later. Clipboard in hand, face set like granite. No wasted motions. No time for show. He nodded to the room, then let his eyes fall on her. The moment he did, the cadet noticed. There was something in the general's posture, a quiet tightening of the jaw, a change in stance, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. Then the general walked straight to her. Not around her. Not past her. To her. And for just a moment he paused. The cadet blinked. His gut tightened. "Ma'am," the general said. "Appreciate you being here." She gave a subtle nod. Nothing more. The general turned toward the podium, adjusted the mic, scanned the room. And then he opened a folder. His voice didn't rise or fall, but every syllable seemed heavier than it should be. "In today's simulation," he said, "we'll be reviewing tactics from Operation Black Halo. Our lead analyst, call sign Echo 7, will walk us through the strike pattern from Phase 3. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, as if the air had been pulled out of the room. Echo 7. The cadet's spine straightened involuntarily. He knew that name. Everyone in the academy knew it. It was legend, a ghost in the system, a name whispered in stories passed down in hushed tones between soldiers too green to know what was real and what was myth. She didn't respond with a glance, didn't shift her weight, didn't flinch. That kind of stillness only came from years of choosing when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. She wasn't there to make a statement. Not with words, not with posture, not with any of the usual social armor that people use to declare themselves as worthy. She stood in the room like someone who knew things others couldn't imagine. Like someone who had been through enough that proving herself to strangers ranked somewhere just above trivial and somewhere below unnecessary. The cadet sat 2 rows behind her, still whispering, still posturing, still too new to understand what kind of mistake he was making. He wasn't being malicious. That was the worst part. He thought he was being clever. But clever doesn't survive long in the field, and charm doesn't clear a room when the intel turns hot. What always does, is composure. And she had it in a way that made the room quieter just by existing in it. She had seen it before dozens of times. People who mistook quiet for soft. Who assumed that the absence of rank meant the absence of authority. They never understood until it was too late that the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one barking orders. It's the one who doesn't need to. The one whose presence says everything before a single word is spoken. The one who waits. She had waited before. In doorways. In alleys. In silence beneath layers of sand and silence beneath layers of frost. She had waited with a finger on a trigger, with blood drying on her uniform, with the names of her fallen written in the cracks of her memory. Waiting wasn't weakness. It was calculation. It was endurance. It was discipline measured in breaths and measured in stillness. And now, in this sterile training room filled with polished boots and sharpened tongues, she waited again. The general hadn't introduced her yet. There was no need. She wasn't there for introductions. She wasn't there for approval or respect. She had come to observe, to assess, to teach without teaching. There were lessons that didn't come with slides and strategies. Some lessons came with a presence. A silence that taught the loudest cadet something no syllabus ever could. A colonel shifted beside her, giving her just a small nod. A quiet acknowledgement passed between those who knew. Not recognition in the civilian sense, not fame, not celebrity, but a kind of unspoken awareness. A professional salute that didn't need to be spoken aloud. She returned the nod without turning her head. She had no need to scan the room. She knew who was paying attention. She always did. The cadet, still unaware of the storm he'd triggered, leaned back in his seat and checked his tablet. He didn't know the briefing file had been redacted. He didn't know her name had been removed for reasons buried beneath layers of clearance. All he knew was that someone had walked into the room without the trappings he'd been trained to notice. No dress uniform. No pins. No stripes. So he assumed she didn't belong. He assumed wrong. She didn't correct him because there was nothing to correct. His words weren't about her. They were about him, his assumptions, his inexperience, his need to see the world in clean hierarchies and familiar uniforms. She wasn't there to break that illusion. The general would do that soon enough. A faint beep echoed from the podium. The general pulled up the first file on the screen. The lights dimmed. A grainy satellite image appeared, marked with red zones and vector arrows. The room straightened. Focus settled in. And she stood, arms folded behind her back, expression unchanged. She remembered that image. She remembered what came after it. The sound of incoming fire. The breathing in her earpiece. The way the temperature dropped before the strike. The way a call sign had carried through the darkness like a lifeline. She had earned that silence. That composure. It wasn't from accolades. It wasn't from praise. It came from knowing how close she had stood to death. From remembering the names of those who didn't walk out of the same missions. From nights where she hadn't blinked because blinking would mean missing the sign, the one gesture that meant pull the team, abort the entry, call it off. That kind of stillness wasn't for show. It was survival. It was respect. Not for herself, but for the work. For the fallen. For what it meant to wear the call sign Echo 7. The general's boots echoed slightly as he walked across the polished floor, clipboard in hand, the kind of silence following him that only came when a room full of soldiers had learned when not to speak. His eyes scanned the space with clinical precision, briefly landing on each cadet, each officer, before finally resting on her. There was no hesitation. No confusion. Just a pause, subtle but heavy. The kind of pause that meant he wasn't looking at her uniform. He was remembering something. A mission. A file. A name not spoken in rooms like this unless the doors were sealed and the records double-coded. She didn't move. She didn't nod. She simply stood there, perfectly at ease in her silence. Everyone else waited for the general to speak, to start the briefing, to set the tone. But the tone had already shifted, even if only a few in the room could feel it. She had been in enough of these moments to recognize when something changed. And this was one of them. This wasn't about credentials anymore. This wasn't about chain of command. This was about memory, operational memory. And the general had just stepped into one. He turned toward the podium and cleared his throat, then flipped the clipboard open with a sharp flick. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It didn't ask for attention, it assumed it. Before we begin, he said, we have an external analyst joining us today. She's here to observe and assist with breakdowns of Phase 3 protocols from Operation Black Halo. A slight murmur rippled through the cadets. Black Halo wasn't public curriculum. It was referenced in upper-tier training modules, but the details were classified. Those who had heard of it only knew it by whispers, case numbers, or debrief summaries stripped of names and coordinates. One cadet's eyes narrowed. Another scribbled something down. And the one who had made the comment earlier, he sat straighter now, sensing a weight he didn't yet understand. The general's fingers paused on the edge of the clipboard. He didn't look down. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked out across the room and his gaze landed right on the cadet who'd smirked. Some of you may be familiar with her designation, he said. Then came the silence. Intentional. Measured. He wasn't rushing the reveal. He was letting it settle. Letting the moment expand. She served as strike commander on 3 live-fire ops in regions you've only seen in simulations, the general continued. Her call sign is Echo 7. It wasn't a name. It was a legend. A codename spoken with reverence in briefing rooms and in the backs of transport carriers before silent drops. Echo 7 wasn't supposed to be real. Echo 7 was the fallback. The failsafe. The final voice on the channel when every other voice went dark. Stories about her had floated through field camps and whispered beneath bunk beds. Stories that blurred the line between myth and mission. Now, the weight of it dropped like a pin in the center of the room. A silence that didn't feel empty, but too full. The cadet's face went blank. He blinked once, then again, as if trying to reprocess everything he had just seen, everything he had assumed. The woman standing near the projector screen, calm, silent, invisible in a room obsessed with image, had just become the most visible person there. Not because of her appearance. Not because of any sudden change in posture. But because the room had finally caught up to her presence. The general didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The name was enough. Or rather, the call sign. Because names belong to people. Call signs belonged to what they'd done. And hers had been earned in places no training module could replicate. The room breathed differently now. Officers subtly adjusted their stance. Cadets who had been half distracted now locked in with a focus that bordered on reverent. The lieutenant next to the cocky cadet looked straight ahead, face unreadable, but his jaw had tensed. He knew what had just happened. The general nodded once, stepped back, and gestured for her to begin. She didn't rush. She didn't posture. She took her time walking toward the center of the room. Not slowly. Not deliberately. Just with the same quiet precision she had always moved with. The kind that said she had nothing to prove. The kind that said she'd done it all and survived. The words left his mouth like any other routine command, but the moment the general spoke her call sign, Echo 7, the atmosphere in the room fractured. It didn't explode. It didn't collapse. It just shifted. Like pressure dropping before a storm. Like a heartbeat skipping a beat in the stillness before action. Everyone heard it, but not everyone understood what it meant. Not at first. But the ones who did, the ones with experience, the ones who had spent enough time close to danger to recognize the names that weren't meant to be spoken out loud, they froze. The cadet who had questioned her credentials just minutes ago didn't speak. Couldn't. His mouth went dry. His fingers clenched the edge of his desk. He was staring straight ahead, but his eyes had lost focus. Echo 7. He had heard the name once before. In a training seminar. Buried in the footnote of a mission debrief that had no names, no coordinates, just a timeline and a note, extraction coordinated by Echo 7. Mission salvaged. Lives saved classified. The officers behind him weren't whispering anymore. The snide glances and quiet chuckles that had filled the room earlier had vanished, replaced with stillness. Respectful, almost reverent. The kind reserved for those who had done more than the record would ever reveal. She hadn't moved. She hadn't reacted when her call sign was said. She didn't puff her chest or flash a grin. She just remained where she was, eyes level, arms relaxed, as though the entire room hadn't just been pulled underwater by the weight of her history. Somewhere near the back, a captain shifted uneasily. He remembered something too. A comm transmission, grainy and warbled, years ago in a blackout zone. The voice on the other end had been calm, clear, surgical. Echo 7. She had directed evac teams like she was moving pieces on a chessboard she had already memorized. He had lost men that day, but not all of them, because of her. He hadn't known the face behind the voice until now. The general returned to his notes without comment. He wasn't surprised by the room's reaction. He had expected it. That's why he'd waited to say her call sign. That's why he hadn't introduced her by name or title. Those things didn't matter in this room. What mattered was presence. And presence was exactly what she commanded now. The cadet's hand moved slightly toward his tablet, almost like he wanted to take notes, to anchor himself, to do something that would make him feel less small in the moment. But he didn't type anything, because there was nothing he could type that would capture what he was feeling. The name Echo 7 was known to those who paid attention. Not the loud ones. Not the ones who chased medals. But the quiet professionals. The ones who had seen what happened when plans failed, when comms went dark, when evacuation wasn't an option and hope was nothing but a code scratched into a helmet. Echo 7 didn't belong to a person. It belonged to a myth. To a voice that came through when everyone else was gone. And now that myth was standing right in front of them. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence do its work. Not out of arrogance, but out of discipline. The kind that knows timing. The kind that understands how to let people arrive at realization on their own. She scanned the screen at the front of the room, then slowly turned her head, just slightly, to take in the audience. Her eyes didn't linger. They didn't need to. She was simply collecting the room the way she had collected battlefield layouts, terrain scans, heat signatures. The cadet shifted in his seat. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the floor, jaw tense, breath shallow. He hadn't apologized, but something in his posture said he wished he could rewind time. Erase the smirk. Take back the whisper. Pretend he hadn't just tried to measure her by the wrong metrics. And yet, she said nothing. She didn't have to, because when the general read her call sign aloud, she had become something else entirely in their eyes. Not a guest speaker, not an analyst, but a mirror. A reflection of what most of them would never become. And for those few seconds, that room, once filled with the sharp scent of competition and pride, now stood frozen in a silence only earned through stories that never made it to paper. The shift didn't come with fanfare or sudden applause. It arrived quietly, like fog creeping in under a locked door. 1 minute she was invisible, just another unknown figure in a room full of uniforms and egos. And the next, she was untouchable. It wasn't magic. It was memory, recognition. The sound of her call sign had reassembled the entire energy of the room without her saying a word. Echo 7. It rang in their heads like a bell no one had expected to hear again. Her identity, once assumed to be insignificant by the cocky cadet in the back row, now hung in the air like a weapon no one could look away from. No one asked questions now. There were no more sidelong glances, no more whispers, no more assumptions. That moment when the general had spoken her call sign had cracked open the thin veneer of certainty they had all been operating under. And now they were seeing her. Not as a figure standing quietly in a room, not as someone whose credentials needed to be verified, but as something else entirely. As a presence. As someone who had done what most of them only simulated. Someone who had survived things they couldn't even pronounce, much less imagine. The cadet's earlier smirk had long since vanished, replaced by a locked jaw and averted gaze. He hadn't looked at her since the call sign was read. Not because he was afraid of her, but because now he was afraid of what she represented. She wasn't just above him in rank or experience. She was above his entire framework of understanding. She belonged to a class of warriors that didn't exist on the posters or in the pages of training manuals. The kind whose names were erased from mission logs, whose mistakes were never public, whose victories were never celebrated, but who carried entire teams on their backs in silence. She still hadn't acknowledged him. Not because she hadn't noticed. She had noticed everything. The whisper, the tone, the way he looked through her instead of at her. But she wasn't here to educate him. Not directly. She knew that moments like these taught more than 1,000 reprimands. She didn't need to punish him. The silence was already doing that. The weight of her reality pressing down against the flimsy scaffolding of his assumptions. The others in the room, Some older, some more weathered, had already recalibrated. A few had stiffened in their seats, their expressions quietly shifting into something more respectful. Some recognized the call sign, others simply recognized the reaction and adjusted accordingly. In the military, you learn quickly to read the room, and this room had been reset. She was no longer just a guest. She was the unspoken center of gravity. Still, she remained silent. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't walk forward with dramatic timing or perform some grand reveal. She just stood there, steady as a mountain, unshaken by the sudden storm of attention, because it didn't matter to her. She didn't need their validation, and she wasn't fueled by it. She had lived through fire. She had operated in chaos. She had earned 1,000 quiet nods from ghosts and survivors who would never say her name out loud, but would never forget it either. There was power in not reacting. It forced others to examine themselves. And now, the cadet sat in that uncomfortable space between shame and realization. He was beginning to understand that the things they drilled into you, how to identify rank, how to read insignias, how to memorize protocol, those were surface-level lessons. But the real ones, they lived in moments like this, when a figure you dismissed without thinking turned out to be the person every senior officer in the room wouldn't dare underestimate. The general didn't look at the cadet. He didn't need to. His focus had returned to her, like the rest of the rooms. He gave a single nod, short, sharp, familiar, and it spoke volumes. The kind of nod given from one veteran to another. From someone who had once given her a mission he didn't expect her to come back from, and who had been proven wrong in the most spectacular way. From invisible to untouchable. Not by declaration, but by presence. And now, every eye in the room that had once skipped over her was locked in. Not out of curiosity, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something slower, something earned. She didn't turn to look at him. She didn't so much as flinch. But the cadet, who had once whispered with casual mockery about the stranger in the room, was now staring at his own hands, the blood draining from his face. The weight of what he had done, of what he had said, settled in slowly. Not like a hammer, but like gravity, an invisible force pressing against his chest, forcing his posture to shrink without him realizing it. He had questioned her presence, her credentials, her right to stand among them. And now, after hearing her call sign read aloud by the general himself, he understood just how deeply he had misstepped. She still hadn't spoken to him. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any reprimand he could have received. Every second she withheld acknowledgement reminded him of just how much she could say, but chose not to. That choice carried its own power. The kind of power that didn't stem from anger or revenge, but from experience. From knowing the difference between someone who needs to be punished and someone who needs to learn. The cadet had seen combat footage, completed simulations, memorized names of operations he hadn't participated in, but none of it prepared him for this. Not the silence, not the humbling, not the lesson written not in lectures or correction, but in the unshakable presence of someone who had lived through the fire and walked out with nothing to prove. Her face hadn't changed. Her breathing hadn't changed. Only the room had. And him. Especially him. He had spent so much time mastering posture, tone, and precision, those clean, polished edges of military professionalism that cadets were praised for, but this was different. This wasn't a lesson he could circle in a textbook or highlight on a tablet. It was something felt, not taught. Something earned in the quiet dismantling of his own assumptions. She moved now. Just a step forward. Smooth. Measured. The kind of movement that came from someone trained not to waste motion. She didn't glance around the room for validation. She didn't look for recognition. She simply stepped into the space the general had motioned to, standing exactly where she needed to without hesitation. The center of the room, but still not the center of attention because the attention had already gathered around her like a tide. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't clear her throat. When she spoke, it was with the kind of clarity that made people listen before they even realized they were doing so. Calm. Unhurried. Precise. Her tone didn't ask for authority, it assumed it. Not through arrogance, but through the lived confidence of someone who had led men through fire, darkness, and silence and brought most of them home. The cadet listened. Not because he had to. Not because the general was watching. but because for the first time he was hearing something beyond the words. He was hearing the space between them, the pauses filled with knowledge, the quiet strength that only came from having faced death and come back not unchanged, but refined. He didn't dare look up. He didn't need to. He could feel it. Every phrase, every example she gave in the analysis of the operation carried the weight of someone who hadn't learned these lessons secondhand. These weren't bullet points from a slideshow. These were lived truths. And he, so proud, so quick to judge, was now sitting in the presence of someone who had paid in more than years or promotions. She had paid in sweat, blood, silence, and survival. Others in the room were listening too, but not like him. He wasn't just absorbing information. He was processing himself, reevaluating every thought he'd had when she first walked in. Every snap judgment, every unchecked assumption. He had assumed authority looked a certain way, walked a certain way, dressed a certain way. And now he was learning what it really looked like. Not sharp creases in a uniform, not a booming voice across a training yard, but this stillness, this composure, this grace laced with steel. She never looked his way, never made him the center of anything. But that was what stung the most. Not the scolding, not the exposure, but the quiet understanding that her silence was the greatest mercy she could have shown him. That she saw what he did, saw the disrespect, and chose to teach, not punish. And in that moment, for the first time in his young career, he understood what command truly meant. It wasn't about being feared. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the flashiest title on the roster. It was about presence, composure, earned respect, and the ability to hold a room without needing to raise your voice.